next week. I need to go into the hospital and get a bone arrow. And if it says it's okay, I can get near some kids, I think, and play with them. And if it isn't okay, I'll have to get the IV again and sleep overnight. And go home the next day.
He wanted so bad to be an altar boy. And he just wasn't old enough to be it yet. And Bruce and I knew that he wasn't going to make it. And Bruce had asked him, how did you put it to him? That you needed extra help, or you didn't have enough boys to help you with the service, and could he please help him out and all this and that. And Bruce let him carry the cross. And that kid thought he was in heaven already, I tell you. He just thought it was the greatest thing. He was so proud.
16 months later, Robbie died. The real tragedy is that a community or neighborhood can be drinking contaminated water for years and have no idea that there's any problem at all. For many of the most toxic contaminants cannot be tasted or seen. The only warning a community may have is when it begins to experience an alarming rate of uncommon health problems, and that may take years. What's even worse, when a community finally does begin to see such a pattern developing, getting authorities to take corrective action can take even longer.
They repeatedly told the local officials that it was bad and that alternative sources should be found. Unfortunately, the city officials didn't do anything about it, continued to use the water supply, and unfortunately the state officials did not enforce their concern on the local level, and so the people continued to drink it and continued to be poisoned in their ignorance.
Not only were they slow to act, they were equally slow to tell the residents what was really going on. Consider these facts. First, even though Woburn had 9 industrial dumps that were on the EPA's list of hazardous sites, the city was not testing its water for organic chemical wastes. Second, in 1975, the state warned the city about high levels of contaminants found in 2 wells. Residents weren't told. Third, in 1977, 2 years later, both the city and state tests found indications of high levels of toxic chemicals in another test well, but the residents still weren't told. And in spite of this, neither the state nor the city ran comprehensive tests for another 2 years. Finally, in 1979, only after the EPA discovered buried drums in the vicinity, did the state test the wells for organic chemical contaminants.
I believe that the water played a major part in the deaths of several children in this community.
It definitely contributed to all the children being sick, not just with the leukemias, but with all the colds and everything else, the learning disabilities, the liver cancers, you know, all the other diseases that have been found around Woburn.
Critics say that because it's impossible to isolate a precise cause, there's no irrefutable proof that contaminants in the water were the sole cause of this clustered outbreak of leukemia. Dr. David Ozanoff is an epidemiologist at Boston University.
I think public health prudence suggests that at the very least, and this is the minimum, that we should act as if the water is causing these problems. And I think that there's substantial evidence to support that proposition right now. And that the burden of proof shouldn't fall on the potential victims in these particular cases. That when you have diseases that take time to develop, you have chemicals in the water that are associated with these kinds of effects and these kinds of diseases, that prudence really suggests and dictates that you act as if there's a serious public health problem there. And indeed, I think the evidence emerging now does indicate that there is such a serious public health problem.
Is Woburn an isolated case, or is it simple?
And now we return to For Your Family's Sake.
I've always loved being around water, whether it's the ocean or a mountain stream. You look at a beautiful lake and you think, thank God we don't have a water problem in America like they have in Africa. Then you see a show like this one and hear about all the toxic wastes that have been dumped in our groundwater supplies, and you realize we do have a water problem. Our supplies are not infinite at all. To the contrary, they're very finite. And as the contamination spreads, the safe water we take for granted becomes more and more scarce. If we don't start taking the problem more seriously, not only will we pay a price, our children and their families will be the real victims.
If If we want to protect our families from the dangers of water contamination, we can't just rest on our laurels and trust that the problem will be taken care of by somebody else. We have to take responsibility for our own water. And we need to become actively involved in supporting local, state, and national legislation to protect our current and future drinking water supplies.
I guess like a lot of people, I didn't think too much about the water I drank. That was before I heard the story of Donna Robbins and the mothers of Woburn. Well, I'm pregnant, and it absolutely sends chills down my spine to know that the water I drink can affect my unborn child. For me, this is no longer just an issue of my health. This one affects the safety and well-being of the most precious thing in my entire life, my baby. You better believe I'm going to do something about it. I think all mothers should.
Perhaps it's no surprise to find that communities in the industrial Northeast have serious problems with groundwater contamination. And yet, this is not a regional problem. Welcome to Tucson, Arizona. Nestled in a valley next to the majestic Catalina Mountains, it is one of the cleanest, most picturesque cities in the Southwest. Hardly a city of heavy industry. Tucson does have the distinction of being the largest city in America totally dependent on groundwater as its only source of drinking water. And just 2 years ago, it was discovered that residents in one area of Tucson had, since as early as the 1950s, been drinking water with dangerously high levels of trichloroethylene, TCE. Now, like Woburn, officials assured the public that no residents were receiving water tainted with TCE above the safe levels. TCE is a tasteless, odorless, and very toxic chemical. It only takes a teaspoonful to taint 250,000 gallons of water. A single gallon of TCE can render undrinkable a year's worth of water for 3,800 people. And yet state experts estimate that more than 4,000 gallons drained into the aquifer. And once again, as in Woburn, the patterns of uncommon illnesses were abnormally high.
I think it's a shame, and you know that something like water is something that we depend on so much is the culprit. Or I think it's sad. Like when the lawyers, they asked, well, when the TV men came and they said, well, what do you want to gain from this? You know, what do you expect to gain? I said, nothing, you know. No amount of money is going to make me walk again. But I would like to know that the water's clean for my son.
We're finding a tremendous incidence of a variety of different diseases that are very rare in this country. For example, we're finding testicular cancer among teenage boys at a rate that far exceeds what you'd expect. We're finding a tremendous amount of leukemia in children and in adults. A lot of lupus, which is a fairly rare disease to find among men, but we're finding it in the Tucson area. Also brain tumors, a variety of other cancers that you wouldn't expect to find in these numbers.
No, Woburn, Massachusetts is not an isolated case, a freak situation. Neither is the neighborhood in Tucson. There is not a state in America that has avoided cases of serious contamination of drinking water supplies. Mrs. Lois Gibbs was one of the Love Canal mothers who didn't give up when she was told that there really wasn't a problem at Love Canal. Today, she runs the Citizens Clearinghouse for Hazardous Wastes.
I lived at Love Canal. I have 3 children, and my children were very, very sick as a result of poisons getting into their bodies. My son developed asthma and epilepsy, liver disease, urinary disease, no immune system, and my daughter almost died several years ago from a blood disease. And I had to stand there and watch my daughter while they did a bone marrow test with a 12-inch needle into her hip with no anesthetic because her blood count was so low, and listen to her scream, "Mama, help me. Mama, take me out of here." It's something that's very dear to me because it was my baby. And now I see it happening across the country, and the reason I got involved was because of my children. It was prevented. My children didn't have to get sick. My daughter has to be checked until she's 21 years of age for leukemia. My son has to be checked for his entire life. Neither one of them may ever be able to have a child. If they have a child, it may be birth defective. And these are my babies. I mean, it's not something that we're talking about at an intellectual level. We're talking about children being exposed to poison.
Water's a very serious matter. If you don't have it for a day, you get uncomfortable. If you don't have it for several days, you die. Add toxic chemicals and toxic waste to our nation's water, and you have our country's #1 hidden health problem. The question before us is not really whether or not our water is poisoned, but what are we going to do about it? You know, you take a hard look at the facts, and it's clear we have a very, very serious matter. EPA has done several studies, of course, and they pointed out as far back as 1980 that 1 out of 3 wells tested in this country shows solvents like trichloroethylene that can cause cancer and birth defects and a whole host of other health problems. EPA did another study where they looked at surface waters, and they found that, in fact, out of the 50 major drinking water systems of major cities in this country tested, out of those 50, every one of them had 1 out of 6 cancer-causing chemicals, at least 1 out of 6 of those cancer-causing chemicals that they tested for. So we know we have serious problems. The examples are endless.
We've got to have clean water. We've got to have healthy people. And it's the mothers of America who are going to make that happen. Because it's the mothers of America who have taken action in the past around this issue and probably will in the future.
As we see what happened to these communities, our first reaction is, it can't happen to me. My community's different. But this false security is quickly shattered when we see the facts and gain an understanding of the magnitude of groundwater contamination. But first, we should take a few minutes to explain what we mean by groundwater and groundwater contamination. Dr. Robert Harris is a hazardous waste expert, formerly of Princeton University.
Of all the fresh water in the United States, 4% of that is surface water. 96% of it is under the ground in the form of groundwater. So that out of every 100 gallons of water that's fit to drink, that's pure enough to drink in the United States, 96 gallons of that is groundwater, is under the surface of the earth. And only 4 gallons of that is surface water in our lakes, in our rivers, and our streams.
That's why America's reliance on groundwater has more than tripled since 1950 and will continue to grow. Already, more than 1 out of every 2 Americans relies on groundwater as the source of drinking water. 1 out of 2. In rural communities, the number jumps to 9 out of 10. What causes this contamination to take place? Well, simply stated, toxic wastes, chemicals, and byproducts are legally or illegally dumped or stored above or in the ground. Now, these poisons gradually sink into the ground and leak into our groundwater.
Well, the nature of the problem with America's drinking water is really multifaceted. We've got something like 300,000 toxic waste dump sites across the country. We've got about 800,000 underground storage tanks, 30% of which are probably structurally impaired, potentially capable of leaking. We've got no regulations on pesticide runoff. We've got a national water pipe system that is full of lead, which is extremely dangerous. We've got sewage treatment plants in many areas that don't work very well. They effectively are discharging raw sewage into our lakes and our streams and our rivers. We have landfills that we dump solid waste, garbage into, and hazardous waste. So you can see that there is the potential for contaminating our drinking water that is just grown up as a result of sloppy ways of doing things.
There's been incidences of contamination throughout the country. In some instances, contaminants have been found at concentrations on the order of several 100,000 parts per billion. And that's, let me put that in perspective. Right now, they're setting standards for the 8 volatile organic contaminants that are most frequently found on the order of 5 parts per billion. So it's just another world. It's a 100,000-fold difference. And the 5 parts per billion are for a chemical that poses cancer. It actually has been proven to be a human carcinogen, or at the very least, an animal carcinogen.
The problem for all of us is compounded by the hazardous chemical wastes that are produced and disposed of each year by American industry. For over 40 years, we've been dumping our chemical waste into the ground, billions and billions of pounds of it, including some of the most poisonous substances in existence. Every year, over 580 billion pounds of hazardous chemical wastes are produced, 90% of which is improperly disposed of. The EPA estimates that there are 400,000 landfills, pit ponds, and lagoons currently harboring hazardous wastes.
You're not provided protection against the vast majority of contaminants, nor are they testing for the vast majority of contaminants. So it becomes a bit of a catch-22 where you find if you call your utility, let's say you are with an urban water supply, you call your utility and they say, we've met all the drinking water standards. You have good, clean water, so call again. But you have no assurance that you really do have good, clean water, because the fact of the matter is they've only assured good, clean water as far as 22 contaminants are concerned. He's told you that those 22 contaminants are not in your water. But what about the other 600? Are they in your water? He hasn't told you that. He doesn't know. He doesn't know. You don't know. You go home and you drink your water, and you are at risk.
The next question we'll look at is, can
environmental activist, we really do have a problem with the systematic polluting of our nation's groundwater. Now, your local water companies and municipalities may be dedicated to providing you with contaminant-free water, but their hands can be tied by inadequate funding, a lack of mandated contaminant testing, or by distribution systems that are antiquated. The long-term solution to our water crisis is to prevent contamination in the first place and to mandate cleanup of the aquifers that are already polluted. But those solutions are long-term, may take years, even decades to resolve. In the meantime, one thing's for sure. You, and you alone, must take the responsibility to protect your family's drinking water. And you can protect your family's drinking water from many of the most dangerous contaminants right now. That's what I'd like to talk to you about for the next few minutes. This is United Environmental's new Watermill water filter, a point-of-use water filter so unique, it's been awarded numerous U.S. and international patents. It's economical, it's easy to install and maintain, and most important, it's extremely effective, especially when compared to the alternatives. For example, small, inexpensive faucet filters are designed primarily to improve the clarity and taste of water, not to remove significant amounts of chemical contaminants. Larger activated carbon and carbon block filters can be very effective in removing organic contaminants, but do not remove unprecipitated inorganic contaminants, such as arsenic, mercury, cadmium, nitrates, and most important, lead. The patented Watermill does. Reverse osmosis units can be effective in reducing both organics and inorganics, but can be very expensive and can require significant vigilance and maintenance. The Watermill effectively removes both organic and inorganic types of contaminants, including lead. Look at the removal percentages it attained in these independent laboratory tests. The Watermill has 3 filters in one unit. First, its pre-filter removes rust, scale, and sediments. Next, its ion exchange filter removes inorganic contaminants that ordinary carbon filters leave in. And finally, its activated carbon filter removes the organic contaminants, such as trichloroethylene, THMs, PCBs, chlorine, pesticides, petrochemicals, and so forth. It attaches to any faucet in seconds. You simply replace your faucet's aerator with the Watermill's adapter and connect it to the Watermill with this connecting line. It's that easy. When you want tap water for washing dishes or whatever, flip this switch down. When you want drinking or cooking water, flip it up. It then diverts the water through the Watermill, providing fresh, filtered water. It attaches to any kitchen or bathroom tap, whether at home, in a hotel, or in a recreational vehicle. So you can take it with you when you travel. But best of all, it doesn't cost a fortune to buy or maintain. Its suggested retail price is $269. But if you order directly from UET, your price is only $196. In most cases, if you use your MasterCard or Visa, it should only add about $10 a month to your monthly payments. $10 a month. What a small price to pay. Now, the Watermill will not be available through any stores for some time to come because UET wants to offer direct to consumers without any retail markups. They've gone out of their way to keep it affordable. Your Watermill comes with a 30-day unconditional money-back guarantee. You'll also receive a 3-year warranty, which replaces your unit for free should it become defective because of materials or workmanship. One thing I haven't mentioned, not only does the Watermill improve the taste of coffee and other beverages, it completely removes the bad taste and odor of ice cubes. But those are just the fringe benefits of fresh, filtered water. There's really only one reason there should be a water mill on your tap, so your family can drink water you can depend on. Ordering is as easy as calling a toll-free number. Now, other filters may look similar on the outside, but they do not have the water mill's patented filtration system on the inside. So don't put it off. Call right now. Believe me, you won't be sorry.
To order your water mill water filter, call toll-free 1-800-223-1100. 1-800-223-1100. Be sure to have your credit card available when you call. Your water mill comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee and a 3-year replacement warranty. That number again is 1-800-223-1100. 1-800-223-1100. And now, back to For Your Family's Sake.
You know, I love having fun. I never like to take anything too seriously. But America's drinking water is one issue that threatens our health and the health of our children. And you can't take that seriously enough. We must do everything we can to protect our children and our communities from the systematic tainting of our groundwater supplies. We have to do it for our family's sake.
Our water crisis is not contrived. It really does exist. It's not just standing still either. It grows worse and worse with each passing year. It's not a game. It can be life and death. Whether you ignore it or not, its impact will not ignore you. That's why you should support local community groups that dedicate themselves to protecting the water your community relies upon. Don't just sit on the sidelines. Get involved now, before it's too late.
When I see a show like this one, it makes me so angry about what's happening to America's drinking water. And yet I know that most of us will never do anything about it, and that's a sin. If only for our country's children, we must do everything we can to protect our tap water. And even more important, we must make sure that the source of that tap water is clean as well, because if we only protect our own water, who'll protect the children when they're on their own?
The Congressional Research Service stated, quote, "This much we know. If toxic chemicals are put into the ground, they will eventually end up in the groundwater we drink. Nearly 80% of the toxic waste end up in the ground, where they will stay for decades, even centuries. The country is literally laced with millions of potential contamination sites."
As little as 10 years ago, the federal government, for example, opened up a model landfill in Kansas. The documents that surrounded this engineering feat said that this landfill was supposed to be secure for at least 5,000 years. And the federal and state government put their stamp of approval on this thing. The private entrepreneur that was operating it at a substantial profit brought wastes there from 22 states. This was a big facility and a showcase facility for the government and for industry. Well, within 2 years, there was evidence that this facility was leaking. Prime evidence that there is no such thing as a secure landfill, which the government now does recognize, but they were naive 10 years ago, which they shouldn't have been.
Too many people tend to trust the government to look out for their health and just assume that the government is doing it. But having worked for the government for, nearly 15 years now in environmental protection, I can tell you that the government really is not doing it. It's very, very much of a, what's the word, a snow job? A facade, the government's protection. Almost all cases of pollution that you hear about are discovered by people, not by instruments, not by government detection systems. The real guinea pigs, the real detection systems are the people drinking the water and their health.
This map pinpoints the location of the 800 chemical hazardous waste sites on the Superfund priority list so far. As you can see, almost no state is exempt. You can imagine what it would look like if the estimated 10,000 priority sites were pinpointed. But waste sites and landfills aren't the only source of groundwater contamination.
Throughout the United States, there are countless numbers of underground tanks that contain a variety of materials, from home heating oil to gasoline associated with your neighborhood gasoline service station, to chemical tanks that store raw materials that are used in chemical processing, to tanks that contain waste materials. And these tanks have a life like everything else does, and occasionally they leak. And over the past several years, we have noticed around the United States an increasing number of leaking tanks associated with all these different uses that tanks are put to. Gasoline service station tanks leaking, the gasoline migrates down into the groundwater. Gasoline being lighter floats on the surface, but in the process contaminates the water under the groundwater, and can either contaminate a private well or a municipal well. And this is occurring at numerous locations around the United States. It's been estimated anywhere from 50,000 to several hundred thousand of these tanks are currently leaking, and many thousands more will leak in the future.
Eugene Rossoff is president of WaterTest, the nation's leading water testing facility. They've tested over 40,000 water samples from virtually every state and county and city in America.
This is an EPA report, and we used it to graphically depict groundwater contamination around the United States. These 25 states report groundwater contaminated by pesticides. These 28 states have contamination from metals. 40 states have reported contamination from organic chemicals. And these 43 states have reported contamination from inorganic chemicals.
This recent EPA report estimates that 42 million Americans are drinking water contaminated with dangerously high levels of lead. That's nearly 1 out of every 5. Levels of lead that can cause birth defects, irreversible mental retardation in young children, health risks for pregnant women, and high blood pressure in adults, and the gradual lowering of children's IQs. The numbers are staggering. 680,000 pregnant women and their fetuses are at risk. 250,000 children per year will suffer a drop in their IQs.
The problem of lead in drinking water in the United States is especially insidious. In fact, let me read you from a prominent medical journal. Pregnant women who during their pregnancy lived in homes where the water had excessive amounts of lead bore a significantly higher proportion of retarded infants. The problem does not stop there. Another prominent medical journal states, damage caused to young children by elevated levels of lead cannot be seen while the injury is occurring. Later in the school years, the affected child shows learning disabilities and behavior problems which we now know come from the effect of lead on the brain. Although lead may be removed from a youngster's environment and blood levels return to a normal state, any damage which occurred is permanent.
Shortly after the EPA report was issued, various state and local officials responded by claiming their water systems didn't have a lead problem.
Although the water leaving the distribution plant is generally lead-free, by the time it gets to your tap or mine, there can be significant levels of lead in the drinking water. It comes from the solder joints in the copper pipes and from lead connecting lines. So in a way, they are correct. At the distribution system, it is fine. But once it goes through all those solder joints and through lead pipes, the water that you and I drink can be contaminated with toxic levels of lead.
Gene, does the American public in general realize what's happening with its drinking water?
In our experience, the American public has usually no idea of what the problems are in their drinking water. 88% of us believe that our water is good to excellent. 9% of us believe our water is below average, and 3% of us know that our water is unsafe to drink. But actually, the situation is reversed. It is these people who have problems, who know they must fix them, who are truly safe. And this large mass of us who cannot see, smell, taste problems such as lead, arsenic, mercury, and toxic chemicals, who are truly unsafe and really should be looking at our drinking water much more carefully.
We don't know where all the contaminants are, how many of them there are, and how widespread it is. We do know that the more we look, the more we find them. And there are substances that are being found in the water that are known to cause cancer in experimental animals and in humans, that are known to cause birth defects in experimental animals, There are things that certainly mothers all over the United States ought to be concerned about, what levels of contamination are in the drinking water that their children are getting. I mean, children are just less able to deal with toxic substances because their systems are just smaller and they get a bigger dose for their body size than an adult does. Many of the standards get set on the basis of what is safe for an adult, when in fact a large number of people in this population are not adults. So these are things that really need to be fixed.
In the meantime, I would strongly advise people to have their groundwater measured if they have any reason to believe at all that it is being contaminated, have it analyzed and tested, to form local grassroots organizations for that purpose, to install water filters in their houses if they think their water may be contaminated in any way, and not to trust the government's analysis necessarily, especially EPA's, because very often EPA ends up contradicting itself and having to come back and do it again and again and again. In general, look out for yourselves and don't think Big Brother is looking out for you, because he's not.
So, who is safe? Where will the next Woburn appear? What can we do to protect our families right now? And what can we do to make sure that our children will have safe drinking water supplies for their families? One thing is certain. It's not enough to simply ask these questions. We must find the answers. And as we find, we must act for our sake, for our children's sake, for our family's sake. I'm Tom Miller.
What a report. Thank you, Tom. How could this happen here in America? What can we do about it? Our guest panel of experts will be answering these and other questions when we return in just a moment.
During the last break, we introduced United Environmental's patented new Watermill water filter. This is the one that removes both organic and inorganic types of chemical and metallic contaminants, including lead. It attaches to any faucet in seconds by simply replacing your faucet's aerator with the Watermill's faucet adapter. A simple flip of the switch diverts your tap water through the Watermill to provide your family with fresh, filtered water for drinking, cooking, or any other use. But there's still one question you should answer before buying any water treatment system. What does it take to maintain that system? Because without proper maintenance, any filter will become less effective. Well, the Watermill is as easy to maintain as it is to install.
You simply replace the filter cartridge located inside the unit once every 6 months. It only takes a couple of minutes and doesn't even require tools.
And UET's automatic cartridge replacement program lets you get your replacement cartridges at half price and make sure that you don't forget when it's time to replace them. With this program, UET automatically ships your replacement cartridges when your replacement is due. You'll never have to worry about forgetting to change your cartridges. Now, if you haven't yet called to order your family's Watermill, here's the number once again.
To order your Watermill water filter, call toll-free 1-800-223-1100. 1-800-223-1100. Be sure to have your credit card available when you call. Your Watermill comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee and a 3-year replacement warranty. That number again is 1-800-223-1100. 1-800-223-1100.
And now we'll return to For Your Family's Sake.
I never really worried about the quality of my tap water. In fact, I never even gave it a second thought. It looks crystal clear and it tastes fine. Why should I worry? But now I find out that many of the most toxic contaminants, including some of the most carcinogenic ones, can't be seen or tasted. For all I know, they've been in my water for years. America, it's your choice.
To be the best in the National Football League, you have to be in perfect condition. That's why I'm really careful about the water I drink. In my book, health is the most important asset. You take care of your body, and it will take care of you. And you know what? I thought football was dangerous.
Not too long ago, I saw a network news program that said that a recent EPA report shows how hundreds of thousands of children will have their IQ lowered each year from drinking water with lead in it. As a mother, I think this is sick. Our children are our most innocent victims of all. We supposedly can look out for ourselves, although I don't know how, when you can't even see or taste lead in water. But nonetheless, our children depend on us to protect them. It's just not right.
We're fortunate to have with us today some of America's leading experts on our water crisis, including Congressman James Florio, co-sponsor of the Safe Drinking Water Act. They'll not only be answering questions from me and my fellow panelists, Lindsay Wagner and Ed Begley Jr., they'll be addressing your concerns as well. Folks, after seeing what we just saw, I'm glad you're here. I'm sure all three of us are anxious to get our questions answered. Let's start with Lindsay Wagner. Lindsay?
Jan, why does it take the authorities so long to respond when it's so obvious?
I think that basically it's because an agency, especially a public health agency, is loath to identify a problem that they may not be able to solve. So they're loath to tell the public that there is a serious health problem, the extent of that health problem, because the public is then going to demand that they do something about it, and the agency has a natural reluctance not to do something when they know that they have not been given the tools, and also when they know that they lack the spirit to do something about the problem.
And the government agencies in the onset of most of these, and I could name hundreds of cases where people have been mobilized around exposure, government agencies almost always turn a deaf ear. Show us the proof. Show us this. And you can't. We're housewives. I mean, I was a housewife and a mother. I don't have a science degree. I have a degree in reality and dealing with the real world. And we had to go out and we had to prove. And even when we brought the proof back, we proved that 56% of our babies were being born deformed. That's hard data. Nobody argues with that. Yet, even when we brought that back, they said, well, gee, like Woburn, we don't know how many of those babies were actually a result of Love Canal and how many of them were the freak incident. And even going that far, you have to keep pushing them politically. It's not a scientific question. It's not a legal question. Congressman Florio said the laws are on the book. It's a political question.
Very much so. We're very frustrated in this state. We passed a law, Proposition 65, that had 200 some odd chemicals attached to it. Our governor has seen fit to publish only 29. When you said earlier, Lois, about dead body evidence, that can be taken quite literally, because they've revised it. The governor has chosen to revise it to say that only chemicals that are known to cause cancer in humans by dead body evidence, not the standard procedure, which is quite scientific, accepted by the National Toxicology Program and the Association for Research on Cancer, International Association for Research on Cancer. These people have come up with a procedure with 2 or more species of animal to determine that things are clearly carcinogenic, and that's been thrown out. We've passed this measure by an overwhelming majority, 2-to-1 majority in this state, and they've issued only 29 chemicals. And it's now being fought, and a judge has ruled in our favor, but it's going to be appealed again. People get frustrated. They go, didn't we pass that law? Proposition 65 about safe drinking water, and what's happened now? PCBs are off it. I could list on and on a boring list of chemicals that are not on it, that are known carcinogens, accepted worldwide by the scientific community.
An even more offensive example of what Lois is talking about, we've got a number of scientific people here, trichloroethylene, TCE. Everyone acknowledges that, in fact, it's a cancer-causing contaminant. It is probably one of the more prevalent contaminants that you find in drinking water around the country. And yet, the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is the law that the agency, EPA, is supposed to be enforcing, has not gotten around to evaluating that as a contaminant. So literally, you could be out pouring TCE into people's water and not be in violation of that law.
Why is it, do you think, that people are so complacent about this very serious issue that affects us all and clearly generations to come? Anyone have any thoughts?
I think because they don't know. They don't understand how it affects them. I mean, people hear about Donna and her story at Woburn, or they hear about the Love Canal story, or they hear about Jackson, Arkansas, and they say, gee, that's too bad, or Silicon Valley, gee, that's too bad, but it can't happen to me. People are fooled. They have the blind faith, I think, that Bill mentioned earlier. Blind faith in government, that they're protecting them. And people just don't understand, and they trust the agency.
It's also a form of denial. It's a denial. They themselves don't want to recognize the problem because they don't want to see it elsewhere, because if they do, it means that there's maybe something very serious in their own community. So just a normal human response to deny a problem.
Dr. Harris, is bottled water any kind of an answer?
Well, Harry, it may be in some circumstances. Certainly in some areas of the country where I have worked, when water becomes contaminated, bottled water or a water treatment device or some in-home method may be important to use. Generally, though, it's not a permanent solution by any means. The studies that have been done by the federal agencies, by Consumers Union and others, often find bottled water to be contaminated as well. Often bottled water comes from the same source as the tap water.
How can you know if your area's type of bottled water that you have access to is contaminated?
Well, that's a problem. I don't think you can in most cases, because.
But even if you could, it's not an answer.
It's
really.
certainly maybe an answer in the short term, but probably not in the long term.
Yeah.
And the other thing about bottled water, as a mother of 3 children, is did you ever try to strain spaghetti with bottled water or bathe your child? I mean, we're talking about real things practical uses of Housewives of America. It's just not practical. You know, you have to run after your children every time. No, don't turn on the tap. You know, use this water.
Reliance upon bottled water, to the degree that that's held out as a response to the problem, almost diffuses the pressure that should build to try to address the fundamental problems that we've been talking about.
We have for some time in this country chlorinated our water. I pose this question to the scientific experts across me. What are the ramifications down the line? What occurs chemically and can occur, good or bad, when water is chlorinated? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I could discuss it. Chlorine has been demonstrated to result in, I think what we now have come to realize is a serious health threat, and that is that it poses a risk to cancer, because chlorine reacts with certain organic compounds in water to produce cancer-causing substances. The dilemma is that chlorine also is beneficial in the treatment of water, because it destroys disease-causing organisms. And if we've made substantial progress in this century on our drinking water, it has been to dramatically reduce the incidence of waterborne disease, and that's because we chlorinate our water as well as other treatment processes, but chlorine is very important in that regard. So it's posed a dilemma of how to reduce or eliminate the cancer threat from chlorine and at the same time adequately disinfect the water to prevent any rise in waterborne diseases.
David, I'd like to direct this to you. We've heard a lot about the ill effects, and certainly Donna has some first-hand information about the ill effects physically. What are some of the other ill effects that we can get from these hazardous chemicals that we all seem to come in contact with? What are the what's the nuts and bolts of this? What exactly occurs?
I wish I could give you a full answer to that question. We just don't know probably most of the effects that are occurring. But the things that we've been most concerned about, of course, are cancer, because those are the kinds of effects that can appear after even relatively small or minimal exposures to many of these chemicals. These exposures, which sound actually very small, like 1 part per billion or 10 parts per billion, are really very, very large at the chemical level. If you think of each one of these sort of little molecules of a chemical as a bullet aimed at one of the cells of your body that could cause cancer, if you have 1 part per billion in a quart of water of some of these chemicals, we're talking about a number of bullets in there that's equal to 1 with 15 zeros after it. Just an enormous number at that supposedly very small amount of chemicals. Those numbers aren't really small at all. They're really quite large. So that's one thing. We're concerned about those cells then later developing into cancers. We're concerned about the effects on reproduction, birth defects, fertility problems, because again, they're relatively small amounts of chemicals, because they maybe only affect a few cells, and then those cells later develop into a baby, could have a major effect. There is a town out in Michigan that had trichloroethylene at 12 parts per million. I think you could probably strip paint with that, or at least run your automobile on it or something. And these people were drinking this water. It tasted sweet to them. That's probably not all that uncommon in small water supplies in many areas, including rural areas of this country.
I think what a lot of people don't realize about the whole
process of setting levels for drinking water by EPA and probably by other agencies is that, to a very large measure, they're not set based on health considerations. They're set based on all kinds of practical considerations. For example, as you pointed out, if a chemical is very prevalent, and lead is one, arsenic is another, EPA will tend to set the level not at where the health effect is, but where its prevalence is. Because to set it much below that, it would have such a tremendous impact that they couldn't cope with it. So they tend to set it at a prevalence level rather than a health level.
We need nationwide standards. But really, until we make it very expensive for industry to use toxic materials and to dump toxic materials, industry's going to go ahead and do it. They watch the bottom line, and we have got to make it expensive for them, and then they will change their behavior, and not until then.
Well, we've talked about a lot of things, and it looks pretty grim. Maybe we should end this by responding to what hope there is from anybody's point of view, political, technical. There's got to be a lot of the upside here.
The hope is here on the program. I mean, people of good faith coming and talking about the problem, educating ourselves and others, mobilizing public opinion, having that filter into policy, having the policy carried out to make the changes necessary to ensure a brighter future and a healthier environment.
I think that mothers and all citizens, anybody, does not have to sit back and drink bad water. You know, there is something you can do. You have to get out there and you've got to fight.
I see a lot of hope to our organizations. People are getting involved. People are doing things, and they are taking care. And, you know, one thing I think is real important is that, you know, there's hope because people can prevent becoming a Wilbur, Massachusetts. You know, they can work towards that. I mean, if I'm going to be out there and fighting, and this is how people feel across the country, I'm going to fight to prevent having a leukemic child. I'm going to fight to prevent having, and people can avoid it by getting involved now, and they are. And I think there's a lot of hope.
Lois, specifically, what can be done about this, in your opinion? What can we do? Whom can we write, etc.?
People should write their congressmen. People should write people like our organization, the Citizens Clearinghouse. Find out who's in your area, who do you need to talk to, who's fighting, and what pieces of legislation might you be able to help. Where do you get your water tested? Where can you buy a water filter? And our organization and other people, your elected officials, are probably the most important people to write because they're the ones who are going to fight for you. And they're the ones who can connect you with people who are already out there, people who are already fighting. It's going to take a joint effort by people who are victims, such as Donna, and people who are elected officials like Jim Florio, and people who are scientists getting together to pushing this thing to make it happen. And so if people could write the Clearinghouse or anyone in this panel, it would certainly help to connect those people together to get them where we need to go.
Well, I must say this has been an inspiring meeting for me. And I think probably we all feel that way.
I certainly do.
My pleasure. I'd like to thank Congressman Florio and our distinguished panel for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us. And, of course, Ed and Lindsay, thank you. Our producer's goal is to have this show seen by every family in America. It's their hope that they will be able to show repeated broadcasts throughout the weeks and months ahead. So keep an eye on your local and cable listings. And when you see it advertised, ask your friends to tune in. Because no matter how well-intentioned we are, if we don't work together, our children and our children's children could be the ultimate victims. Adequately addressing such a critical issue would require dozens of hours of programming, not just one. We've only scratched the surface. But hopefully, you know a lot more now than you did before the show. And even more important, I trust you won't sit idly by while one of our nation's most precious resources is systematically ruined for generations to come. Together, we can make a difference. But you must act instead of relying on someone else to act for you. For your community's sake, and most important, for your family's sake. Thank you for joining us.
This program has been sponsored by United Environmental Technologies. While their watermill water filter may be the answer to your family's immediate need for filtered water, it's extremely important to realize that we must look beyond our individual immediate needs and join together to work for the long-term cleanup and protection of our drinking water supplies. We urge you to write Lois Gibbs at Citizens Clearinghouse for Hazardous Waste to find out how you can become involved right in your local community to protect your water resources. It's vitally important that you stand up and unite with others in your community. Please don't expect someone else to do it for you. Write today.
If you haven't already called to order your family's watermill water filter, I hope you'll write down the number and call right now. Please, don't put it off. Believe me, you won't be sorry. Here's the number once again.
To order your watermill water filter, call toll-free 1-800-223-1100. 1-800-223-1100. Be sure to have your credit card available when you call. Your watermill comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee and a 3-year replacement warranty. That number again is 1-800-223-1100. 1-800-223-1100.
If you don't read the Wall Street Journal,